Hi, it is Dustin here with Dustin's Dollars, and today I'm going to talk about a very polarizing topic, and that is Bitcoin. I'm going to be talking about what Bitcoin is, sort of a brief introduction for investors. I'm not going to be delving into deep technical details here, but mostly just looking at some of the properties of Bitcoin and trying to get a general understanding of what it is so that folks can start to reason about it and think about it as an investment. So, as I said in the title, I'm going to have a 1 second answer, a 1 minute answer, and a roughly 10-minute answer to what is Bitcoin. And I will start off with my 1 second answer, and that is that Bitcoin is digital gold. There you go. So now for my 1 minute answer, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the properties that you have there, and really uh, in one more level of detail. Bitcoin is it's a computer. It's a decentralized peer-to-peer network that exists to keep track of who owns how many bitcoins in a very secure manner. The network sort of follows some rules by design, and that lets us make some certain assumptions about Bitcoin and draw conclusions about some properties that it has. A few interesting properties that it has, and I'll talk about how those are similar or dissimilar from gold. The first property is that it is decentralized, and that is just like gold, right? No one controls gold. People have exchanged, have treated gold as something valuable for centuries and millennia, and no one ever really controls it. We just sort of accept that it is valuable, and no one controls it necessarily. It is a Bitcoin, just like gold, is what we have term a bearer's asset, meaning if you hold a bar of gold in your hand and you give it to me, I assume that you are the person who owned that, and I take that as valuable. And just like that with Bitcoin, there is a way to show that that is your Bitcoin and that you can transfer it, and that now, after it's been transferred, I can show that it is now my Bitcoin, and so I am the person who actually sort of holds it. Um, Bitcoin, unlike gold, is digital, and hopefully that's obvious to everybody. You probably already knew that, but I just want to call it out there. That has some very nice properties that I'll go into later on. Um, Bitcoin is subdividable, and gold is to a degree subdividable, I guess. I mean, I suppose you could melt down a bar of gold and divide it into smaller units, but in general, it's a very involved process, right? If I owned a bar of gold, there's no easy way for me to say, great, I want to buy, a loaf of bread from you. Please let me just shave off a tiny little chunk of gold there and give you the right amount, right? Gold is not very good at that. Um, and one property that Bitcoin has, and this is one of the most interesting properties from an investment perspective, is it has a fixed supply. There are only, or will only ever be, 21 million Bitcoins total. Um, and as I mentioned, Bitcoins are subdividable. There are 100 million smaller units called Satoshis um, that comprise each Bitcoin. But overall, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, meaning so there are 21 million times 100 million total Satoshis, which is the smallest unit currently in the Bitcoin design, there will ever be. And so that is sort of the total number of Bitcoins that will ever exist. And so that gives you some interesting properties from an investment perspective, because you know that the supply is fixed. So hopefully that was about 1 minute. That is my 1 minute answer. Looks like I ran about 2 minutes. Oh man, already failing my own promises. So let me go on to a more in-depth discussion of Bitcoin. I'll talk just a little bit about some of the different components of the network, the Bitcoin network, how that works, so that you can understand a little bit more and convince yourself, or at least have some insight into how those properties actually make sense and hold to be true. So, as a one very, very quick introduction into the primitives that are needed for the Bitcoin network, there's this concept of public and private key cryptography. And this is a very complex topic, but it basically, you can have a pair of keys that go together, a private key and a public key, And the private key is something that if it was your private key, you would keep to yourself. The public key is something that you can share with everyone. And if you have the private key, you can sign a message such that anyone else who has the public key can sort of verify that you were the one who signed it with your private key, and vice versa. If you have the public key, you can sign a message such that then only the person with the private key can sort of decrypt that message. And so that is some of the very base functionality that underpins all of Bitcoin. But what that lets you do is it lets you use that private key effectively as your, what do I want to say, your you can derive a Bitcoin address from that private key, and that is how you can actually make transactions with the Bitcoin that is yours, that is, you know, owned by your private by your Bitcoin address. You use that private key in order to make transactions, and we call it signing transactions when you want to send Bitcoin to some other address out there. And that actually gets me onto transactions, because I said, you know, the network really exists to keep track of who owns how many Bitcoins. You could even maybe say more specifically, it tracks who owns which Bitcoins or which specific Satoshis, which portions of a Bitcoin. I guess that's not true. It does actually track how many, kind of. But that those transactions are really what comprises a network, right? It's really just a whole bunch of transactions, which a transaction is, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but mostly just sending Bitcoin from one address to another. And those transactions, as time goes on, get sort of aggregated together into blocks. And there is roughly, the Bitcoin network overall as a system produces one new block roughly every 10 minutes. And each block consists of a whole number, a bunch of transactions. I can't recall off the top of my head exactly how many transactions, you know, what the maximum number is per block, but you know, let's say it's 100. And again, I don't actually know if it's 100 or 1,000 or if I'm off by an order of magnitude there, but each block has a whole bunch of transactions in it, and each of those transactions basically are of the form that, you know, this many Bitcoins are, this is again a simplification, but we're owned by this address and now are going to be owned by this other address, or sometimes it can be split and we can send some to this address and some to that address and some to that address in a single transaction. But those transactions get put together into blocks, and every 10 minutes, one new block gets produced, and it gets put at the end of all the blocks that have been produced up until that point in time. And each of these blocks sort of point back to the prior block, and each one points back and back and back to the prior block until there is the very first block of Bitcoin. They call that the Genesis block, the very first one. And that whole sequence of all those blocks, that is the blockchain. I'm sure you've heard that. I think I have so I have a visual here from Wikipedia that gives you at least some bit of a visual in terms of what the blockchain looks like. And forget about all these. This actually shows you a little bit down here. These are the transactions. Forget about the hashes here. Those don't matter for today's discussion. But all of those transactions get stuck into each block, and then you know, each block points to the previous block. And so these, you know, we have block 10, block 11, block 12, and this is, you know, showing sort of that blockchain here where you have this sequence of blocks. And that is what the blockchain is just the sequence of blocks from one after the other. And the powerful thing that that this gives us, and that this is the actual it's non-obvious, but this is the fundamental problem that Bitcoin solved that some prior systems that try to do sort of digital money or digital currency did not solve in a as good of a manner, is actually being able to order all of the transactions so that we can look at all the transactions from the beginning of time all the way up until now, and be able to validate that all those transactions are valid and that no one is trying to spend the same Bitcoin twice, right? That's actually a very it's a very hard problem to solve in when you're talking about computers, where we can, you know, overwrite things. You know, if I have entries in my database that might represent how many Bitcoins each person owns, but actually, if I really wanted to, I could go in and modify how many Bitcoins you own or how many Bitcoins I own. As you know, today, actually, banks can do with your bank account. If they really want to, they can go in and say, nope, actually, you don't have $10,000, you have $2. But with Bitcoin, that is not really possible because of this blockchain structure that sort of makes everything, puts everything into a sequence, and and the the blocks all have this just built-in structure where they all are they all refer back to the prior blocks, and so we're able to actually validate each time that the current blockchain does not have any modifications to it. So that is what the blockchain is, and there are certain machines out there, computers running as miners. We call them block miners, I guess, Bitcoin miners, and those miners actually are the ones that produce new blocks. In order to produce a new block, they basically take in transactions from the rest of the network, and they put all those transactions all together into a block, and then they have to do some computation to People like to say that they're solving like a math puzzle. That's not exactly how it is. It's sort of like they're trying to find the right number that goes along with all those transactions in order to make all of the math work out so that the block is valid. And that's about the most detail I'll go into today. You can, if you're a software engineer, you can read up on it. But that is what the miners do, and it's basically each miner has to just try out a whole bunch of different numbers and see if those numbers will work in order to make their block valid. And when they find a valid block, then they send it out to the rest of the network and say, hey, this is the next block. And then everyone reads that block in and sticks it on the end of their view, their copy of the blockchain, and then everybody starts working on figuring out what is trying to put together the next block of the blockchain. And as I said before, a new block is produced about every 10 minutes, and there's a mechanism in the design of Bitcoin that actually makes it that sort of regulates how hard it is to make a new block in terms of how hard that math puzzle is, in order to actually regulate the time that it takes to produce a block, so the blocks are produced roughly every 10 minutes. So that is, if you ever hear the proof of work, that's something that people talk about with Bitcoin, and that is what is necessary in order to produce a block, in order to make that block actually valid, right? Then the miners have to do a whole bunch of work to find the right number that fits in there that makes a block valid, given all the transactions that are in there. It's a very simplified version, but hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to leave questions in the comments. There are also other computers that are out there that are running Bitcoin nodes, and Bitcoin nodes aren't necessarily the same as miners. Nodes are basically nodes don't try to produce new blocks. Nodes just listen, and when they hear new blocks, and they update their sort of view of the blockchain when a new block has been produced. But what nodes do is they actually read in that new block, and then they validate that block is valid. And when they look at they first check, did that miner, when they sent out this block, did that miner have a valid answer to that math puzzle that goes along with the block? And they also check, are all of the transactions that are in this block valid transactions, right? When there is a transaction in that block that says, hey, Bitcoin address A tried to send 5 Bitcoins to Bitcoin address B, it validates, did Bitcoin address A actually have 5 Bitcoins? And was the signature on that transaction actually valid? Was it actually coming from Bitcoin address A? Was it signed with its private key? There's a way to, again, check that with the public private key cryptography. So that is what the nodes do. And the sort of the interesting thing about the Bitcoin network and the design of this is the incentive structure that you have, where nodes really just want to validate everything and make sure that everything matches up and is still good according to all of the rules of the Bitcoin network. And miners do all the heavy lifting. They do the actual computation work, and that's where you hear out people having entire data centers that are just mining Bitcoin. That those are the Bitcoin miners, and they're doing a bunch of work there to produce these blocks. And when each new block that is produced, there is a small amount of Bitcoin that actually gets sort of comes into being. That is sort of a reward for that particular miner to have mined that block on the Bitcoin network. And so that miner gets to keep a certain number of Bitcoins every time that they are able to produce a new block. And all of the miners, the miners all sort of compete. There are different miners out there in the world. And they all compete in order to produce the next block. And so this is actually one of the things that lets Bitcoin, or increases the reliability of Bitcoin, and why actually I think the Bitcoin network has had, I believe, pretty full reliability for almost a decade at this point, where it hasn't gone down. It has produced a new block, roughly every 10 minutes, because miners are actually incentivized to keep up and keep running and keep producing the next block, because they get this reward for every block that they do produce. And again, the nodes also have the incentive to hear about those blocks so that they can update their view of who has what. And they have this incentive because presumably most nodes are actually run by folks who hold Bitcoin in some form or fashion. And it's not a particularly, it doesn't require a lot of an expensive computer or anything special to run a Bitcoin node. And every Bitcoin node that runs and actually sort of has its view of the blockchain that is sort of plugged into the overall peer-to-peer Bitcoin network helps secure the network and validate it by ensuring that the blockchain actually matches all the rules in the Bitcoin design. And so that would prevent, let's say, miners trying to change things and that do not actually fit the rules of the Bitcoin network. And if nodes actually got a block that they then didn't like, they would just discard that, and they would not actually count that block as being valid. And so that actually, sort of gives the incentive for miners not to produce a block that is invalid, because they have to actually spend work to produce a block. And so if they spend work to produce a block and then the nodes don't accept it, they've actually just wasted all of that work. And when we say work, we mean, again, computers that are running, that are consuming power, and adding load onto those machines. So it costs them actual real money in order to do that. So that's a bit about how the network works. A couple other things that are interesting from a financial perspective or from an investment perspective is, as I said, there is a fixed supply of Bitcoins. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins per the current design. And as I mentioned, there is actually a reward that gets given to the miner each time a new block has been produced, a new valid block. But the amount of that reward actually gets lower and lower over time. And this is where, if you hear the term Bitcoin halvings, if you've ever heard that, that refers to the fact that every 4 years, roughly every 4 years, again, that's sort of corresponding to the 10 minutes per block timing that is built into the design. Every 4 years, roughly, the amount of Bitcoins that are the reward for producing a new block gets cut in half. So 4 years from today, the reward for a new block will be half of what it is today. 8 years from today, the reward for producing a new block will be 1/4 of what it is today, and so on and so forth, all the way until this basically becomes negligible and goes down to zero, which is currently estimated to happen, I think, around the year 2140. So well into the future. But there is actually a point at which when you cut this in half enough times, it becomes effectively zero. And now there are no longer any new Bitcoins that get introduced into the world. And that is how we can actually say that there are only 21 million Bitcoins that will ever exist. So so not only do we know the total supply of Bitcoins, we also, again, because of that sort of halving schedule, we know the schedule at which those Bitcoins will be distributed into the world. And so that is actually another very interesting thing that you can start to look at. And I will use this as a basis for some future analysis that I do. but I wanted to sort of go over that today just so that folks have a general understanding of the fundamentals of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is a little bit different than stocks, in the sense that for stocks you can look at, the fundamentals are the actual company itself, and the ensuing cash flows that they produce. Bitcoin is different, but this is actually, I think, the basis of how we can start to analyze Bitcoin in a principled manner. So that is roughly what I wanted to cover today. Again, I think Bitcoin is very interesting, and a lot of people, I would say myself included, 5 years ago, or even let's say 3 years ago, sort of dismissed Bitcoin just as a made up thing that doesn't really have relevance and is probably not worth anything. I've changed my opinion on that. Still not, it still carries risk, just like pretty much any other investment, but there is a lot of, I think there is actually a lot of fundamental uh, value that you can start to reason about and understand. And so I will go into that in more detail in some future videos. So yeah, that is what I wanted to cover today, and I hope you learned something. And feel free to add ask me questions or add comments down in the comment section. I will try to answer them for you. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.